My name is Ashley Bushow. I'm in public speaking, and this is my third speech. I want you to imagine living hundreds of years ago, before doctors understood germs, disease, or even what happened to the human body after death. Someone in your village dies from a mysterious illness. A few days later, another person gets sick, then another. People have no idea why this is happening. Eventually, they dig up the first person who died, and when they open the coffin, the body doesn't look the way they expected it. It still has hair, the skin hasn't completely decayed, and there's even what looks like blood around the mouth. Today, we know those are all normal parts of decomposition. But back then, people thought they had found proof of something much more terrifying. Folklorist Paul Barber explains that many of the characteristics people once believed prove someone was a vampire can actually be explained by normal human decomposition. In other words, what looks supernatural actually had a scientific explanation. So that raises an interesting question. How did misunderstandings about death turn into one of the most famous monsters in history? To prepare for this speech, I researched scholarly books, journal articles, and historical sources that examine the origins of vampire folklore, the 18th century vampire panic, and how literature transformed vampires into the characters we recognize today. Most of us probably picture Dracula, Twilight, or maybe a vampire from a TV show when we hear the word vampire. But those familiar characters actually evolved from beliefs that once terrified real communities. Today we'll explore where vampire legends began, how Eastern European folklore shaped them, and how literature transformed them into the vampires we know today. Let's begin with where vampire legends first started. Long before vampires appeared in novels or movies, ancient civilizations already believed the dead could return to the living. Many cultures told stories about restless spirits or undead beings that came back after death to harm the living. These creatures weren't exactly the vampires we think of today, but they share many of the same ideas. According to Barbara Brodmann and James Doan, the universal vampire, many ancient cultures developed remarkably similar stories about the undead beings, even though they lived thousands of miles apart and had no contact with one another. So why did so many civilizations create these stories? The answer is actually pretty simple. People were trying to explain things they couldn't understand. Imagine trying to explain disease, sudden death, or epidemics without microscopes, medical research, or modern science. Trying to explain disease without science is kind of like trying to solve a puzzle with half of the pieces missing. People naturally looked for explanations, and sometimes those explanations were supernatural. Another major reason vampire beliefs developed was because people misunderstood what happened to bodies after death. Today, forensic scientists understand decomposition very well, but centuries ago, people didn't. For example, after someone dies, gases can cause the body to swell. Hair and fingernails can appear longer because the skin shrinks. Sometimes dark fluids leak from the mouth, making it look like the person recently drank blood. To people hundreds of years ago, that looked horrifying. Paul Barber explains that many physical characteristics once believed to prove vampirism can now be explained through formal forensic science. Instead of seeing natural decomposition, people believed they had discovered someone who was still feeding on the living. Those misunderstandings laid the foundation for vampire legends. Ancient fears created the first vampire stories, but those stories became much more detailed as they spread into Eastern Europe. This is where vampires started looking much more like the ones we recognize today. Throughout Slavic and Eastern European folklore, stories of vampires became incredibly common. People believed vampires could leave their graves at night, attack family members, spread disease, and even cause livestock to die. Because these fears were taken seriously, communities developed elaborate ways to prevent the dead from returning. Some graves included garlic, others contained iron objects, chains, or large stones placed on the bodies, In some cases, people even buried the deceased with sickles placed across the neck or the chest, believing the blade would stop the body from rising. These sound like scenes from a horror movie today, but at the same time, they were genuine attempts to protect entire communities. According to archaeologist Samuel Wilson, discoveries of these unusual burials show that people truly believed they were preventing vampires from returning from the dead. The fear became so widespread that Europe eventually experienced what historians call the vampire panic. Between about 1725 and 1755, reports of vampire attacks spread across Eastern Europe. When unexplained deaths occurred, villagers sometimes blamed vampires instead of disease. Communities would actually dig up recently buried bodies searching for evidence. If the body looked well preserved, they believed it confirmed their fears. Some corpses were even staked to the heart or burned because people believed it would stop future attacks. One of the people who documented these events was a French scholar named Augustin Calmet. Rather than simply repeating rumors, he gathered reports from across Europe and carefully examined the stories. Historian Cyrian Craig explains that Calmet's work was one of the most important historical records of 18th century vampire beliefs. Even though Calmet didn't necessarily believe every story, he preserved valuable evidence showing just how widespread these fears had become. At this point, vampire legends had spread throughout Europe, but they still weren't the elegant vampires we recognize today. That transformation happened because of one famous novel. Although vampire legends began as folklore, one book transformed them into a worldwide phenomenon. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. Instead of portraying a vampire as a mindless monster wandering through villages, Stoker created Count Dracula. Dracula was intelligent, he was wealthy, he was mysterious, he lived in a castle, he wore elegant clothing, he could charm people before attacking them. Many of the vampire characteristics we think of today became popular because of this novel. The cape, the castle, the aristocratic appearance, and the sophisticated personality. These weren't necessarily part of the earliest vampire legends. In Dracula, Bram Stoker combined centuries of European folklore with Victorian fears about disease, immigration, and the unknown to create one of literature's most influential characters. His version of the vampire became the blueprint for countless stories that followed, and vampires have continued evolving ever since. Today, vampires appear everywhere: movies, television, books, video games, streaming series. Some terrifying monsters, others are superheroes, some are tragic anti-heroes struggling with immortality, and others are romantic characters like many of us have seen in movies or shows such as Twilight or The Vampire Diaries. What's interesting is that every generation seems to reinvent vampires in a way that reflects its own fears and interests. Centuries ago, vampires represented fear of disease and death. Today, they're often used to explore identity, loneliness, morality, and even romance. Even though they've changed drastically, they're still connected to the same legends that began hundreds of years ago. Today, we explored how ancient fears created the first vampire legends, how Eastern European folklore shaped those beliefs into recognizable vampire traditions, and how Bram Stoker and modern media transformed them into vampires we know today. Although vampires are now fictional characters in books, movies, and television, their origins were rooted in real fears, limited scientific knowledge, and centuries of cultural tradition. The next time you watch a vampire movie, read Dracula, or see someone dressed as a vampire at Halloween, remember that behind the cape, the fangs, and the supernatural powers is a legend that began with ordinary people simply trying to understand the unknown. Thank you.